Welcome to this episode of Great Cities and Institutions. Today, we are going to look at Himeji Castle and at a tradition of fortress engineering that solved the same problem as the castles of Europe and solved it in almost exactly the opposite way. Every week on this channel, we step inside the great cities, empires, and institutions that shaped the world we still live in today, tracing not just when they rose, but why and what it actually cost to build something meant to last forever. Some of these stories are about walls and monuments still standing. Others are about entire systems of government and belief that vanished centuries ago, yet somehow still shape how we live, how we're governed, and even the words we use, without most of us ever realizing it. In our Castles trilogy, we looked at Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, and we asked in each case what the buildings told us about the state that produced them. Today, the question is different. Today, it is about engineering, because Japan faced a problem that Europe did not, and the solution it arrived at inverts almost every assumption you hold about what a castle is. Here is the difference in a sentence. European castles are stone buildings. Japanese castles are wooden buildings standing on stone. That is not a stylistic preference. It is a response to the ground itself. And once you understand why, the entire tradition makes sense. By the end of this episode, you will know why a Japanese castle is built of timber in a country full of stone, what a fan slope is, and why it cannot be climbed, why thousands of castles were deliberately destroyed by the government that had just won the wars, how Himeji survived being sold at auction for a trivial sum, an American firebombing, and an earthquake that leveled a nearby city, and where the English word tycoon comes from. Let's begin with the problem. Japan sits at the meeting point of several tectonic plates, and it is among the most seismically active places on Earth. Major earthquakes are not rare events in Japanese history. They are a recurring feature of it. Now consider a European castle in that environment. A stone wall is a stack of heavy blocks held together by mortar and by their own weight. It is exceptionally strong against a battering ram, an arrow, and eventually a cannonball. It performs superbly under a vertical load, which is what gravity supplies. An earthquake does not supply a vertical load. It supplies a violent horizontal one, and it supplies it repeatedly in both directions. Mortared masonry is brittle. Under lateral shaking, it cracks, and once cracked, it fails. And when a stone building fails, it does so by dropping several tons of rock onto whoever is inside. Japan learned this early and permanently, and the architectural response runs through the entire culture. Timber frames, sliding partitions, rather than load-bearing internal walls. Buildings designed to move. Timber is flexible. It bends and returns. A joint that can flex absorbs energy that would shatter a rigid one. So, the Japanese castle takes the form it does for a reason that has nothing to do with defense and everything to do with the ground. But you still need mass, and you still need a base that cannot be undermined or scaled, which produces the arrangement that defines Japanese castle architecture. An enormous stone platform, built without mortar, carrying a timber structure on top. Let's take the stone first, because it is the most sophisticated part. The stone base is called the ishigaki, and it is dry stone construction. No mortar at all. That is deliberate. A dry stone mass can shift slightly under seismic loading and settle back. The individual stones move against one another. Friction absorbs energy, and the structure survives. A mortared wall in the same conditions cracks and comes apart. The work was done by specialist masons, and the most celebrated were a hereditary group from the province of Omi, near Lake Biwa, generally known as the Arno Masons. They were retained by successive warlords, their techniques were guarded, and their reputation was such that having them build your walls was itself a statement. There are broadly three grades of construction, and you can identify them by eye. The roughest is built from natural stones, largely unshaped, fitted together with smaller stones packed into the gaps. It looks irregular, and it is extremely strong. The intermediate grade uses stones that have been partially worked so that their faces meet more closely, and the finest uses precisely cut blocks fitted so tightly that the joints are barely visible, which was expensive, slower, and used where appearance mattered. Behind the visible face, and this is the part nobody sees, the wall is packed with a deep layer of small stones and gravel. That backing serves two purposes. It transfers the load from the earth core behind it, and it drains. Water accumulating behind a retaining wall is the classic cause of failure, and in a country with a rainy season, it would be fatal. So the wall is drained, flexible, and unmortared, and some of these structures have now been standing for 4 centuries in one of the most seismically active countries on Earth. Now the shape, which is the single most elegant thing in this episode. A Japanese castle wall is not straight. It curves. At the bottom, it slopes outward at a relatively shallow angle. As it rises, it becomes progressively steeper, until near the top, it is close to vertical, and at the very top, it frequently overhangs slightly. That profile has a poetic name, the fan slope, because it resembles the curve of a folding fan. It also has a blunter name, mushagishi, which translates roughly as warrior repeller, and it does 2 jobs at once. The first is structural. A wall that is broad at the base and tapers as it rises distributes load efficiently into the ground and resists overturning under lateral force. The curve is close to the shape a retaining wall wants to be, and it was arrived at empirically over generations by masons watching which walls survived earthquakes and which did not. The second is defensive, and it is beautifully simple. A climber can start up the shallow lower section without difficulty. The angle then increases steadily. There is no point at which it becomes obviously impossible, so the climber continues, committed, expending energy. And somewhere near the top, the wall becomes vertical, and then tips outward, beyond vertical, at exactly the moment when the climber is most tired, most exposed, and directly beneath the defenders. It invites the attempt and then defeats it. Compare that with a European curtain wall, which is vertical from the ground and simply says, no. The Japanese wall says yes, and then changes its mind. Now, the timber structure on top. The most visible element is the tinshu, the great tower or keep, which is what people photograph. Around it stand yagura, turrets, and connecting structures, walls, and gatehouses. The tenshu is a timber frame building, and the joinery deserves attention. Japanese carpentry of this period achieved an extraordinary standard, using complex interlocking joints cut so that timbers hold one another without relying on metal fastenings. Nails and metal fittings were used in places, but the primary structural connections are cut wood meeting cut wood. Those joints are not rigid in the way a bolted or welded connection is. They have a small amount of give, and under seismic loading, that give is the difference between a building that flexes and one that snaps. Rising through the center of the tenshu are great pillars. Himeji has 2, one to the east and one to the west, running from the basement up through the structure, and they are around 25 meters tall. There is a story attached to the western pillar that is worth telling, because it survived into the 20th century. During the major restoration carried out in the mid-20th century, the western pillar was found to be decayed and had to be replaced. a suitable tree was needed, and an enormous cypress was located in the Kiso region. It cracked during felling or transport, depending on the account, and could not be used as a single timber. A second tree was found in Hyogo Prefecture, and the replacement pillar was ultimately made from two trees spliced together. So, one of the two central columns of the most famous castle in Japan is a joint made in the 20th century from two trees because the first one broke on the way. Above the frame sits the roof, and the roof is doing structural work. Japanese castle roofs are heavy, thick clay tiles laid over timber. That weight is not accidental. A heavy roof on a flexible frame lowers the building's natural frequency of oscillation, which changes how it responds to ground motion, and it holds the structure down and together. Fire was the other great threat, and the answer to it is the reason Himeji looks the way it does. The exterior timber is coated in a thick white lime plaster, applied over the whole structure, including the eaves and the joints between roof tiles. The plaster is fire-resistant, and it protects the timber underneath from both burning arrows and weather. It also makes the building brilliantly white, and Himeji's popular name is Shirasagi-jo, the White Heron Castle, because from a distance it appears like a bird about to take flight. Not all castles are white. Matsumoto, further inland, is finished in black lacquered boarding and is known as the Crow Castle, and setting photographs of the two side by side is one of the pleasures of the subject. Now the defensive design, and here something interesting happens because Japanese engineers arrived independently at several principles we described in the Welsh episode. The approach to Himeji's keep is a maze, and it is deliberate. The path from the outer gate to the Tenshu does not run directly. It spirals, doubles back, passes through a series of enclosures, and includes dead ends. Gates are set at angles to one another so that an attacker who forces one cannot see or charge the next. The route narrows and widens, slopes change. An attacking force moving through it is repeatedly turned, repeatedly funneled, and repeatedly exposed to fire from above and from the sides. That is precisely the same reasoning behind Edward I's angled gatehouse passages, arrived at on the other side of the world without contact. Gates are frequently arranged as a masugata, meaning a box shape. An outer gate opens into an enclosed square courtyard, with the inner gate set at 90 degrees. Attackers forcing the outer gate find themselves not inside the castle, but in a walled box, overlooked from all sides, with another gate still shut in front of them. That is a killing ground, and it is the same concept as the space between the walls of a concentric castle. The walls carry openings called sama, and Himeji has around 1,000 of them. Their shapes indicate their purpose. Rectangular and tall openings suit archers. Circular, triangular, and square openings are for firearms, because a matchlock requires less vertical movement than a drawn bow, and a smaller opening exposes the shooter less. The mixture of shapes across the walls is therefore a record of the transition from bow to gun, visible in the architecture. Projecting from the walls at intervals are ishiotoshi, meaning stone drops, boxed openings that overhang the wall face, allowing defenders to drop stones or fire directly downward at anyone at the base. That is a machicolation, and it exists for the same reason machicolations exist in Europe, because the base of a wall is otherwise the one place an attacker can work unobserved. And then there is a feature people always ask about, so let me deal with it carefully. Nightingale floors are corridors constructed so that the floorboards chirp when walked upon, and the standard explanation is that they were an anti-intruder device, making silent approach impossible. The most famous examples are at Nijo Castle in Kyoto rather than at Himeji. historians and conservators are genuinely divided on whether the effect was designed or emerged from the way the floorboards were fastened, with the nails and clamps rubbing as the boards flexed, and the sound becoming more pronounced as the building aged. The effect is real, and you can hear it. Whether it was intended is not settled, and anyone who tells you confidently either way is going beyond the evidence. There is one more feature at Himeji worth knowing, and it is a good trick. From the outside, the keep appears to have 5 stories. It actually has 6 floors above ground and a basement below. One floor is concealed, hidden by the arrangement of roofs so that it does not read from outside. An attacker who had studied the building from a distance and calculated where the defenders would be wrong by 1 level. Now the history, because Japanese castles, as we picture them, existed for a remarkably short period. For most of Japanese history, fortification meant the Yamajiro, the mountain castle, a defended position on a mountain, using the terrain, with earthworks, ditches, and timber palisades, and relatively modest buildings. You climbed to it, and its strength was the mountain. 2 things changed that in the 16th century. The first was politics. The Sengoku period, the age of the country at war, ran from the late 15th century into the late 16th, and it was a prolonged collapse of central authority in which regional warlords, the daimyo, fought continuously. That produced a need not merely for refuge, but for control. A lord needed to govern territory, tax it, administer it, and be seen to rule it, and a fortress on top of a mountain is a poor place to do any of that. The second was firearms. In 1543, a Portuguese ship arrived at the island of Tanegashima carrying matchlock muskets. Japanese smiths reverse-engineered them with remarkable speed, and within decades, firearms were being produced in quantity and used in large numbers. Guns changed the requirements. Timber palisades were inadequate, walls needed mass, and defenders needed positions from which to shoot. So castles came down from the mountains onto hills at the edge of plains, and then onto the plains themselves, sited to control roads, rivers, and the growing towns that clustered around them. And they became enormous, and they became decorative because they were now statements of authority as much as military positions. The pivotal building was Azuchi, constructed by Oda Nobunaga on the shore of Lake Biwa between 1576 and 1579. It had a great tower of unprecedented scale and elaboration, with painted interiors by leading artists, gold leaf, and an interior arrangement intended to impress visitors with the personal magnificence of its owner. It is generally regarded as the first modern Japanese castle, and it established the form that Himeji and everything else followed. It stood for 3 years. After Nobunaga's death in 1582, it was burned, and only the stone base survives. His successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, built on the same principle at Osaka on an even larger scale and continued the unification of the country. Which brings us to Himeji itself. There had been a fort on the hill since the 14th century. Hideyoshi built a 3-story keep there in 1581. The castle you see today was built by Ikeda Terumasa, who received the domain after the decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, and who rebuilt on an enormous scale between 1601 and 1609. It is not one building, but a complex of over 80 structures. The main keep, 3 smaller connected keeps, turrets, corridors, gates, and walls, arranged within a spiraling system of enclosures. And then, almost immediately, the wars ended. Tokugawa Ieyasu won at Sekigahara in 1600, took Osaka in 1615, and established a shogunate that would govern Japan for over 2.5 centuries, which produces the most striking piece of policy in this entire episode. In 1615, the Tokugawa government issued the order commonly known as one castle per province. Every domain was permitted to keep a single castle. All others were to be demolished. Hundreds were destroyed, and estimates of the numbers vary, but the reduction was drastic, from something in the low thousands of fortified sites to a few hundred. The same year, the government issued regulations governing the military houses, which, among many other provisions, required that castles could not be built, and existing castles could not be substantially repaired without permission from the shogunate. Read that again, because it is remarkable. A lord could not repair his own walls without applying to the central government. We have seen versions of this before in this series. In England, fortification required a royal license. In Scotland, Robert the Bruce destroyed castles because he could not hold them. But this is different in kind. This is a victorious central government, at peace, systematically demolishing the fortifications of its own subordinates, and then regulating maintenance of the survivors so tightly that a castle could decay legally but not be repaired without permission. It is one of the most effective disarmament programs in history, and it is a large part of why Japan then experienced roughly 250 years without significant internal warfare. The castles that survived stopped being military installations almost at once. They became administrative centers and residences, the seats of domain government, with towns growing around them. A great many Japanese cities today are laid out around a castle that stopped being a fortress in the 17th century. Himeji, notably, was never attacked. It was completed just as large-scale warfare in Japan ended, and its extraordinary defenses have never once been tested. That transformation deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it shaped modern Japan more than the fortifications did. A Japanese castle in the Tokugawa period sat at the center of a jokamachi, a castle town, and those towns were deliberately planned. The layout was concentric, and it was social. Immediately around the castle lived the senior retainers in substantial residences. Beyond them, the lower-ranking samurai. Beyond them again, the merchants and artisans, organized by trade into their own districts so that you would have a street of dyers, a street of carpenters, a quarter for the fish market. Temples were frequently placed at the edges of the town, partly for religious reasons and partly because temple precincts could function as defensive strongpoints on the approaches. The street plan itself was defensive. Roads were laid out with deliberate doglegs and T-junctions rather than long straight runs, so that an attacking force could not charge directly toward the castle, and so that sight lines were broken. A number of Japanese cities retain those awkward junctions today, and drivers curse them without knowing why they exist. Water was managed carefully, with moats fed from rivers and canals used for moving rice and goods to the castle stores, and the whole arrangement was an economic engine. The castle held the granary and the treasury. The samurai were paid in rice stipends that had to be converted into money. The merchants did the converting, and a commercial class grew wealthy inside a system that formally ranked them near the bottom of the social order, which is why so many major Japanese cities are castle towns. Tokyo grew around Edo Castle, and the imperial palace stands on its site today, with the original stone bases still visible. Nagoya, Kanazawa, Okayama, Kumamoto, Matsue, Hiroshima, and a great many others began the same way. So when the castles were abolished, the cities they had organized did not disappear. They simply lost their centers, and a great many Japanese urban plans still carry the ghost of a fortress that is no longer there. Now, the second destruction, which was worse than the first. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate fell, and the Meiji Restoration began, and Japan set about dismantling the feudal order at extraordinary speed. The domains were abolished. The samurai class was abolished as a legal category, and the castles, which were the physical symbol of the old order and were also expensive, militarily useless buildings occupying valuable urban land, became a problem. In 1873, the government issued the Castle Abolition Order, designating most castles for disposal. A small number were retained for military use. The rest were to be sold, demolished, or their materials disposed of. Enormous numbers were destroyed. Some were dismantled for their timber and tiles. Some were simply burned. And Himeji was put up for auction. It sold for 23 yen and 50 sen. The figure is frequently quoted, and the point of it is the sheer triviality. It was not a valuation of a masterpiece. It was the scrap value of the materials, and the buyer, according to the account, wanted the roof tiles. He then worked out what it would cost to take the building apart and remove the material, concluded that the demolition would cost more than the salvage was worth, and abandoned the plan. Himeji Castle survived because it was not worth pulling down. It was subsequently taken into army use, which preserved it, and campaigning by an army officer named Nakamura Shigeto is credited with saving it from destruction. A restoration was carried out in the Meiji period, and a much larger one in the 20th century. Now the third threat, and this one is extraordinary. In 1945, the United States conducted a firebombing campaign against Japanese cities, and it destroyed a great many castles. Nagoya, Okayama, Wakayama, Hiroshima, and others were lost, along with the historic timber structures of numerous cities. Himeji City was bombed on the 3rd of July, 1945, and a large part of it burned. The castle was not hit in the way the city was, and there are two elements to the standard account. The first is that the castle was camouflaged with netting to disguise it from the air. The second, and more remarkable, is that an incendiary bomb landed on the upper part of the keep and did not detonate. The castle stood, essentially undamaged, in the middle of a burnt city. Then, in January 1995, the Great Hanshin earthquake struck the Kobe region, killing over 6,000 people and causing catastrophic damage across the area, including the collapse of modern concrete and steel structures and elevated highways. Himeji is roughly 40 kilometers from the epicenter. The castle sustained essentially no structural damage. The commonly repeated detail is that a small bottle of sake left on the top floor did not fall over. That detail may well be embellishment, but the substance is not. A 400-year-old timber building on an unmortared stone base rode out an earthquake that destroyed contemporary engineered structures nearby. That is the vindication of the entire design philosophy arrived at by masons and carpenters with no theory of seismic engineering over generations by observation. Himeji was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1993, among the first in Japan, and it underwent a major restoration completed in 2015, principally replacing roof tiles and reapplying the white plaster. That restoration caused a mild controversy because the freshly plastered castle was startlingly white, and people accustomed to the weathered version complained that it looked wrong. It will darken. It has begun to, which is a familiar problem. We encountered exactly the same objection in the Scottish episode, where restored harling on tower houses looks incorrect to people used to bare stone that was never the intended finish. Now, some context on what survives. Of the many thousands of fortified sites that once existed in Japan, 12 castles retain their original keeps, meaning towers that have stood since the feudal period without being destroyed and rebuilt. 5 of those are designated national treasures: Himeji, Matsumoto, Inuyama, Hikone, and Matsue. Everything else you see, including some of the most famous silhouettes in the country, is reconstruction. Osaka Castle's present keep is a reinforced concrete structure built in 1931, with a lift inside. Nagoya was rebuilt in concrete after the war, and there is an ongoing debate about reconstructing it in timber using traditional methods. That debate is genuinely interesting. A concrete reconstruction is durable, fire-resistant, and accessible. A timber reconstruction is authentic, enormously expensive, and raises questions about disabled access and fire regulation that are difficult to reconcile with historical accuracy. There is no obviously correct answer, and different countries have resolved it differently. Now, a word, because this channel has a habit. When American ships under Commodore Perry arrived in 1853 and forced the opening of Japan, American negotiators needed to understand who was actually in charge. The emperor was in Kyoto, largely ceremonial. Actual power was held by the shogun in Edo. In dealings with foreigners, the shogun was referred to by the title Tycoon, meaning great lord or great prince. Americans brought the word home, and it entered English as tycoon. It was applied first to political figures, and by the late 19th century to businessmen of great wealth and power. So the word used for an industrial magnate comes from the Japanese title for a military dictator, acquired by American diplomats trying to work out who to negotiate with. A practical note, as with the other castle episodes, Himeji is easy to reach. It sits directly in front of the railway station, roughly 15 minutes on the fast train from Kobe and under an hour from Osaka, and you can see it from the platform. Allow more time than you expect. The walk from the gate to the keep takes a while because the route is a maze, which is the point, and the interior involves climbing 6 floors on steep wooden stairs. You remove your shoes at the entrance and carry them, so wear something you can get on and off easily, and be aware that the floors are cold in winter. Go early. It is among the most visited sites in Japan, and on busy days, the keep is timed entry with waits. Do not skip the West Bailey, which most visitors do. It contains a long connecting corridor where the daimyo's household lived, and it is the best place to understand the castle as a residence rather than a fortress. If you want the comparison, Matsumoto is the one to see. Black rather than white, on flat ground with a moat rather than a hill, and with a moon-viewing wing added in peacetime that has no defensive purpose whatsoever. Bichu Matsuyama is the highest of the surviving originals, on a mountain, and it requires a genuine climb. Inuyama is the smallest, and to many people, the most charming. Hikone and Matsui complete the 5 national treasures, and if you find yourself at Osaka Castle, enjoy it, but know what it is. The stone base is original and enormous. Some of the individual blocks are extraordinary, and the tower on top of it was built in 1931 out of concrete. So let me draw it together and compare it with what we found in Europe. The European castle is a stone answer to a human problem. It exists to stop men getting in, and its history ends when a technology arrives that stone cannot resist. Artillery ended the medieval castle, and the walls that had defined power for 5 centuries became, quite suddenly, expensive liabilities. The Japanese castle is a timber answer to 2 problems at once: men and the ground. It solved the ground with flexibility, which is the opposite of the European instinct. Not mass-resisting force, but structure absorbing it. Dry stone that shifts and settles. Timber joints that give. A heavy roof used as ballast. A wall curved because the curve is what survives shaking. And it solved the human problem with geometry rather than thickness. Mazes, angled gates, boxed courtyards, concealed floors, and a wall that lets you climb most of the way before defeating you. And then the Japanese castle did not become obsolete. because of technology. It became obsolete because it won. The wars ended, a single government took control, and that government destroyed the castles of its own subordinates by decree and forbade the repair of what remained. Not artillery, policy, which produced the strangest outcome of all. Himeji Castle, one of the most elaborately defended structures ever built, with 1,000 loopholes, a spiraling maze of gates, a concealed floor, and walls specifically shaped to kill people who had almost finished climbing them, was completed just in time for 2.5 centuries of peace. It has never been attacked, not once in over 400 years. It was auctioned for the price of its tiles, saved because demolition was uneconomic, missed by a bomb that failed to go off, and shrugged off an earthquake that flattened modern buildings 40 kilometers away. The most perfectly defended castle in Japan has survived everything except a siege, which is the one thing it was built for and the one thing that never came. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the great cities, empires, and institutions that built the world we live in. Leave a comment below telling us which castle, city, or institution you would like us to explore next. And if you have walked up to Himeji yourself, tell us about it.